All right. Good morning, everyone. Meeting will now come to order. It's 10 a.m. The chair sees a quorum. We have on the calendar today House Bill 1417, but first, continuing with our efforts this session to do some look-backs on legislation that we had previously passed. We have with us Wei Liao, who is the lead research engineer at Purdue University, and Dr. Tom Iseley, also from Purdue, and their biographies have been distributed to the committee. They are working on the implementation of Senate Enrolled Act 272 from the year 2022, which includes the establishment of the Water Asset Management Center at Purdue University under SEA 272. And that was legislation we passed last session based upon a recommendation of the wastewater task force the year prior. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Wei Liao and Dr. Tom Iseley to give us an update on those initiatives. So welcome.
So Wei and I really are delighted to be here with you to talk about some of the things that we've been able to work on this past year since the passage of SEA 272 and how we're looking at some of the initiatives in moving forward, and we appreciate the opportunity to present that to you. And so what we want to do here in the next few minutes is just really provide an introduction to what we're doing. And then Wei will come and talk about the implementation ideas and progress that we've made. And then I'll wrap it up talking about some of the things that we're doing right now, as well as our ideas on sustainability of a water asset management center. So in doing that, we'll talk a little bit about the utility or underground infrastructure team that we have at Purdue that's working with us. It's not just us. We have a group that's working with us, and then talk about how that's going to come together with the establishment of the Asset Management Center at Purdue to accomplish the vision, as I see it, as stated in SEA 272. And we realize that 272 didn't just happen. It's a result of a number of initiatives that's taken place over the past few years, actually going back as far as I can tell to some of the major accomplishments starting in 2015. And so we're very impressed with the process that has led us up to the passage of SEA 272. But we feel like that now is just the beginning of really making some major accomplishments in what needs to be done in the state. And actually, with us being here is not just something that has happened in recent years. My involvement in asset management took place when I was serving as a senior advisor to the commissioner of the Department of Watershed Management in the city of Atlanta, and under Shirley Franklin, a little over 20 years ago, when she inherited the largest consent decree in the country, and she had a real passion and vision for where they need to go in water with the water program, and not just accomplishing the objectives of the consent decree, which is $4 billion to meet the minimum standards, but her vision was to have a passion for being first in class. I had an opportunity again to work with the commissioner to help accomplish her vision a little over 20 years ago. Strong background in technical solutions for water and wastewater programs, and also for understanding the problems through condition assessment. But I began to realize that you can have the best solutions in the world, and you can have the best understanding of what the problems are, but if you don't have that under some type of comprehensive risk-based management system, asset management system, you still may not be making the right decision to spend the right amount of money at the right place at the right time. So that was what we were concerned about in getting involved with EPA and doing some research work and trying to understand more about what asset management really is about when we talk about utilities. So I'm going to ask Wei to come forward and talk about some of the ideas we have on implementing this plan. So we've been thinking about this for a year as to how we need to be placed at Purdue to accomplish this vision for asset management in the state of Indiana. And so I'm going to let her talk about some of the steps that we've been working on. So, Wei?
Okay. Good morning. And I'm thrilled to be here to talking about our plan and our idea and talking with you all. And so we all know that we have a long way to a long ways to get from the old disconnection, the managing the things, come to a very integrate approach. And we think that have a solid system in place is when it comes to managing our water system, it's very important. And that's why we have the passion about promoting the use of the asset management practice. So again, we thank you for all the author to writing this bill to move this. I think it's our effort to these industries. So since we found out the last year, we talked with the IFA. We have been communicate many times and make sure we understand their need. Okay, we have done a lot of research and surveyed and use our experience, many years of experience, come up with a plan. And we think that this plan is work for the state of the Indiana. So, but we are open to hearing all your thoughts and feedback. If our plan is not doesn't meet your expectation, and we are happy to make the change to make it work for you. I have to let you know that my pronunciation for English is not very perfect, and then if there is anything I don't make it unclear, and then just let me know, and I will try my best to explain it to you. And okay, now let me talk about this program. So we focus on the water system, including the managing the drinking water, wastewater, a stormwater system. In this system, including the above facility and the underground pipeline system. Okay, as we can see in here, and there is 5 key components of the to understand the water asset management. And the first is the current state of the asset. We need to know what we have and where it is and what is the condition they are. And then we have established the level of the service and meet the net level of service, and then analyze the the critical assets, and also calculate the life cycle cost. And based on the minimum life cycle cost, we can develop the long-term fund plan. This is all the process of the developer asset management. One of them is the first one is all about having accurate information. So that means it's a state of the assets. And then the next 4 step would be follow-up and analysis and analyzing that information. But now for the most important starting point, and is getting a good, accurate database and asset management assessment system in place. Once we have that, and the other part is just go through the analysis process. And the goals use the asset management is to provide the best service possible while keeping the cost lower as we can, so we can make sure our resource and get the best result for everyone involved. Okay, then next step. Okay. Based on what we know about the water asset management and the different part, the water infrastructure system, so our program have these features. So it is a strong systematic approach that cover all aspects of the water and wastewater and stormwater system. and including the water treatment plant and the pipeline system, distribution system, and collection system. And we will have many industry involved, from the engineering to the finance. And also we will follow the numerous regulatory standards. And also we have to consider the practice, the environment that the water infrastructure in. Even though we have there is a lot of support and for using the asset management to address the things that the aging infrastructure and limit funding and climate change and more, there are still some big challenges when it comes to how to develop the asset management. We have to overcome these challenges. This including we lack of the comprehensive theoretical guidance. We have a guidance in place, but we still need to get more detail how to develop, collect the data, inspection the asset, something like that. And also we lack of the professionals in the field and lack of the coordination with every different departments. There's also a need for more rigorous and evidence-based approach, and need more engagement with the stakeholders, like the customer and regulators and our utilities and the customer and the people. And finally, and we have a strategy of the skilled workers that in the water industries, which make it very hard to find people that we need to do this work effectively. So we talk a lot about how the asset management challenge, and the most I have impressed many people talking about the file is dead file, not a living file. So we will I think like to address all the challenges. Set up a water asset management institute is very necessary. So why, and at Purdue and the water asset management center at Purdue, we have many like the advantages. First, we have a very strong team led by Dr. Iseley, and with a leader. He is a leader in the asset management field, and had our team had a lot of knowledge and experience. We also have a platform that bring together the experts from different industry and the academy. And we are affiliated with this organization called Berry Asset Management Institute International. We have found that the biggest challenges is managing the underground pipeline system, which is why Dr. Iseley, when he started this organization and try to bring the attention to this often overlooked area. So, and finally, we have a lot of support from the Purdue University. So first step, we have to we set up our goals to meet the requirement. We understand the requirement of the Senate Bill 272, and these three goals, I think, if we achieve these three goals, it became easier to achieve meet the requirement. The first, we want to develop an integrated, intelligent water asset management system. And you can see this is the South Korea. Our team and our team member have developed this integrated management system for South Korea country. They use this system, and for about 80 cities. The whole country only have 400 city system. So 80 cities use this system, and the major significant result is before they before they implement the asset management, the water loss will be like 35%. And then after a few years, and they made this plan to repair and locate the risk area, repair it, and then they come to a result is dropped down to 15%. That's a significant outcome. So, and in this system, and we will computerize all the process and build a serious statewide database. The database will include in all the assets and also the history and current, the condition, and also the operation, the record. Everyone in this system, everyone have the asset into this system, so it would be very easy for us to collect all the data. And also, we will make it simplified and affordable for the people to use. This is our goals, the first. And the second is, when we build this system, we need a guidelines to how to use this system and how to build this system. We need to develop the guidelines, also the operation manuals. This is the long-term, not a long-term goal. This is our ultimate goal. Provide a very comprehensive the guidance for develop the asset management. So it will make this entire the system can obey the objective basics, the guidance. And once we have the system and the guidance in hand, and we will very easier to provide the technical assistance and the education training part. For the education training, and now we can set up a lot of like the workshop and webinar and conference, something, the temporary training program. And also our goal is to set up the world's first academic department for water asset management to provide the sustainable support and provide the workforce development. Achieve these goals. Okay. So to achieve these goals, we have like developed the step-by-step the process we need to follow, and we use the principle is like from very simple to very complex, and like the utility, small utility, only used for the residential water and from the small to the large city. And the first we need to establish the classification standards. So we will divide every kind of utility into several classification. So the second we will establish the workflows for how to start the asset management, and we follow the workflows. We will establish the evaluation standard system, and based on the system, and we collect all the data and then classify all the data, the samples, and then we establish the serious database. And going to develop the integrated and intelligent asset management system. And also we will put the asset management review function into this system. And once we get up this all set up, and then we will establish the water asset management service system. And the long-term goal is like establish the Purdue Water Asset Management Department. And we have already talking about the department with the Purdue leader. So I'm talking a little bit about how we classify all our program. In the system, we will have to set up several many like template as more as possible. So our goal is to customize each water utility asset management plan. But for the management system, we have to have some common classification. And so we classify the area based on the infrastructure used first, and like residential area, industrial area, and mixed-use area, and the hierarchical classification is from the basic to the complex area, and we can still divide it into further. Is like vertical classification is. Water system have the asset management plan, the procedure, and wastewater is different procedure. Stormwater is different. So I mentioned about the last step is the research, education, and training. So we want to train them all these professionals in the industry to help to improve and implement the asset management in all the utility. We cannot hire the people in our center to go out to assist them. We have to educate all the people, have the concept, have the ability to use our system, and to use the manual to do the asset management by themselves. And then we develop the professional graduate education program, and also some research project, including some like water quality and water resource protection, this kind of topic, the research. Okay. So for this program time and just the amount of the time we need will depend on the amount of the support, including this your requirement, and what is your requirement, and what is the effort of the personal support, and the most important thing is the financial support. So if we have enough fund, we can work all the several things simultaneously, such as we can collect the data, analyze the data. At the same time, we can build a database and build a software system. So if we doing the risk approach, had the advantage that allowing us to test and refine our program as we go. And if the funding is limited, and we will have to take the thing step by step. So we don't have the estimated time in our mind is if it's a reasonable funding, and we expect that we have an initial program in place within 1 to 3 years, and then we can expand and update it every years. So I will show you some components of auto asset management cost. This is the phase one, the cost. So we first is development cost. We collect the sample data and develop the sample asset management plan cost. The second is database construction cost, and integrate intelligent water asset management software platform development cost, and also follow up is the guidebooks and course development cost. And for a special like sample project cost, we can follow the asset management 5 components. The first cost is data collection cost, and then the data analysis cost. For now, we need some support, and the first, we need the help from the government department to coordinate and select the sample area and utility, and coordinate with them to help us to implement our plan. And in terms of the financial assistance, we need the 4 part of the support: the sampling fund and database construction fund, and integrate this software development fund, and also the course development funds. So we had, since last year, we have done a lot of research, a survey. We travel a lot to meet with the people, communicating with them to understand the whole country, the situation, also the international situation. So that's why we can come up with that plan, step-by-step plan. And we also have the opportunity communicate with the representative from the IFA. And so based on this, I will come up with this plan, and then we follow on this plan. We have taken action. Even we don't have any fund, we have taken action to start our plan. So I'm gonna turn over to Dr. Iseley to talking about what we are doing for this plan. Thank you.
So we spent time this past year actually visiting with utilities in the state of Indiana, and to complement that with things that we have experienced from other places that we've been involved with across the country as well as internationally. So we've had an opportunity to be at Greensburg when they opened up their new treatment plant. We went down to Florida. We were informed that they have a very aggressive asset management program down there, so we spent a day there working with them. And then also working with Greenville, Indiana. We were brought in there because they had a particular emergency, urgent matter that they needed to deal with, and so we were able to go down there and meet with them and actually learn from them as to some of the things that they're doing as far as asset management is concerned. So we tried to spend time this year looking at what the state of practice is in the state of Indiana. Not only that, we've teamed up with various companies. Ziptility is a mapping company, and Brian Fano has contracts with a number of small utilities on operation and maintenance. And SmartView is a company we've worked with for a number of years that does pipeline inspection work, condition assessment. George Kurz is well known internationally for a lot of work that he's done on infiltration and inflow studies and the impact that it has on states as well as utilities. So during this past year, we had an opportunity to bring this group together and then actually put it into an action plan. So we started out with Switch City. Switch City, small utility, and we felt like that was a good place to start because they have a water system and a sewer system, and they have some specific needs. And so we felt like that we could go in and help put together an asset management plan for them and try to develop it so that it can be a model for other utilities as we move forward. We have, over this past year, been very active with Alliance Indiana Rural Water. We've done 2-hour workshops at their conference in French Lick a year ago, and that's when we first met Senator Koch, and you did the luncheon presentation there, so we were there for that. So with Switch City, they already have a map that was based on existing information, but we actually took some tools down with us to actually open up the manholes and use a zoom camera to go in without going into the manhole itself, but then to inspect the manholes and look up the pipelines with the zoom camera. And one of the things we found is that the map that they have, and it's in GIS, there was a lot of issues related to the connectivity. So it's very important to actually get in the field and collect this data and make sure that what we have is accurate. So one of the things that I've done is I've created a course. I first taught it at IUPUI. You have my bio. I was head of the construction program at IUPUI twice, Purdue School of Engineering, and there was 9 years in between the 2 times I was there, and I was out of academia, and that's when I worked with the City of Atlanta and other companies in advancing the science and practice of asset management. But I teach a course that has to do with the underground asset management. And and also involved with the Barrett Asset Management Institute. I wanted to mention that the Barrett Asset Management Institute been around for a little over 20 years. I started it when I was working with the city of Atlanta. And you might say, well, why Barrett? Well, what we found out when I was working with the commissioner on the water program to try to meet the mayor's vision is that the biggest challenge of really making sure that the water assets were operating as effectively as possible had to do with the part that's out of mind, out of sight and out of mind. That's the pipelines. That's where we lose our water, our drinking water, and that's where we end up with a lot of infiltration inflow. And those have tremendous impacts. For example, we did a study utilizing George Kerr's own Switch City, just looking at their data, taking their data from their flow from their treatment plant, and with the analysis that we did, were able to document that it cost them at least $10,000 a year just to deal with the infiltration inflow. That's one small city in Indiana. So when you think about the impact statewide, that's where we need to focus on. Obviously, the treatment plants are a part of it, but that's really, when you really look at the complexity and the challenge, the treatment plants are the easy part. The hard part is really dealing with that underground infrastructure that's been in there for many years. So we're focused, our Asset Management Center will focus on all of it, but we also want to make sure that we're dealing with the most critical part of a water utility. So there'll be future courses. We have through the asset management program with BAMI, which was really based on research work at EPA, we've had over the past, since 2015, a 4-course online training program that people from 16 countries have taken. So we have the basis and a certification program for professionals in the industry already in place. So this center that we're talking about will really be a joint venture between Purdue and the Barrett Asset Management Institute. That's an international effort. So we have the team, we have the vision, we have the program in place, and at Purdue and through the Barrett Asset Management Institute to really, I think, accomplish what needs to be accomplished as far as what the vision is for 272 in the state of Indiana. So with that, we'd like to conclude and just say thank you for the opportunity to be here with you, and we're very impressed with the fact that the state of Indiana has this bill in place. We've done a lot of work at other states, looking at other states, and we feel like it's the first that really put something like this in place. It'll be a model for many other states. So with that, we'll say again, thank you.
We thank you for your presentation. And I was just going to remind the committee, one of the features of 272 was there will be no state funding without an asset management plan. And that is one of the many significant things about this program is that we have tied an asset management plan to any state funding, grants or loans or any such thing. So with that, Senator Leising is recognized.
Senator Cook has heard me kind of whine about this particular issue before, Dr. Iseley, but I represent 7 very rural counties, okay? They're little small cities that have water systems, and then there's some sporadic rural water systems. And then there are lots of people that I represent that survive on filtered pond water for their drinking water. Very common cistern water for their drinking water. I would say there's a lack of infrastructure within that rural water system. I mean, there's some here and there, but I don't think they've figured out how to get to all these places, nor has there been a great pattern. Sometimes when you see which direction they've gone, it's like, wow, that doesn't seem like that would have been the way to go. Okay, and building has continued. And these are people that have homes that would probably be valued now at over $300,000. So it's not like they're little nothings, right? So when you guys do this plan, please, are you going to try to address that infrastructure in those more rural areas in our state?
I appreciate that question because a lot of the focus that I've had with asset management, even though I really got involved with the city of Atlanta, has been on small rural utilities and understanding the needs. As a matter of fact, when I put the proposal together to get the EPA grant through the Baird Asset Management Institute, we made sure that the Georgia Rural Water organization was part of the team. In other words, we had academic subcontractors, but I wanted to make sure that we had an organization that represented it represented the small rural utilities to be there to oversee what we're doing. That what we did with the EPA grant 2006 to 2008 was not just an academic exercise. And as you saw here, one of the things that we did this past year, I serve on the Citizens Energy Technical Advisory Group. We meet every month, for the drinking water. But where our focus has been on looking at 272 has been with, Switch City and, and Greenville and other small utilities. And I think we will make sure that we stay focused on meeting the needs of, rural water systems across the state and those areas that we need to provide services to. So it's a statewide issue, and the real needs, probably about 90% of the water needs has to do with the small utilities. It's been a statistic that
I don't have any idea how many of my constituents have this issue, but it's a significant number.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In fact, I'll recognize Senator Perfect next, but the larger systems do have in-house technical expertise. 272 was really focused on systems that we represent, the Switch cities of the world, that don't have that in-house expertise, right?
That's exactly right.
Senator Perfect is recognized.
Thank you. That was one of the things I was going to comment at. I would hope that, to be a little more specific and follow up on Senator Lysing's comment and Chairman Cook's, is that I think that's one of the things you're going to try to build is some best practices and some ways that smaller utilities can have the resources to move forward. I just had an interesting story to share with you and the rest of this committee. I was out Tuesday serving for a board meeting on another board that I serve on. A woman on that board who has a pretty big consulting business and operates a consulting company that works for airports all around the country, lives not too far from me. Another big issue that we have worked on here is rural broadband. She told me that she's getting a broadband, but she still doesn't have city water. So we move broadband ahead of water in some of the work that we've done here, and it's sort of like, that doesn't seem quite right. So anyway, yeah, but I think in many of the rural communities, that's the case. They're going to have broadband before they have city water.
That's a really good point. As a matter of fact, you know that we have a new president at Purdue, and one of his focus areas is making sure that we have broadband across the state. And we met with the vice president and his chief of staff yesterday to really emphasize the importance of this water. Because we can live without broadband, the water and getting water out of ponds, that's not.
I mean, it is a serious issue. I worry about people in my district that are, and I can tell you that until about 10 years ago, only thanks to my husband, that we are hooked to a rural water company because he's a kind of a salesman personality, and he sold Senator Perfect all of our land neighbors, and so that if he got enough people that were willing to sign, then he begged the rural water company that was the closest. Otherwise, I still would be, for my house, on 15-foot surface water spring-fed wells, which we did have a filter and chlorinator in our basement, but I'm telling you, a lot of my neighbors don't. And I mean, they get what they get when we have a hard rain like it's going to happen tonight. God bless them on what their water quality will be like.
Well, I understand that. My father, I'm originally from North Carolina. My father was mayor of a small town on the coast of North Carolina, very small fishing community. When we moved there, when he moved there, I was already out of the house by then. It was wells, but the wells had so much sulfur in it you couldn't really use the water. I mean, it really had an odor to it that would drive you out of the town. And he was there and was able to bring in a community water system. So I understand the issues and how important it is, and that's the reason we're really focusing on a lot of the small rural utilities. That's one thing I appreciate about this bill, is because I saw in it that, yes, a lot of the larger utilities that I've had an opportunity to work with, they have a good staff that's that understands asset management. But when I've been to the town council in Switch City 4 times and met with them, wonderful people, but they really need help in knowing how to do this. They don't have a staff. They don't have their own people out there taking care of the utilities. They have it contracted out and the mapping, and that's good. But they need help in knowing how to move forward with an asset management program. When we were there, just real quick, when we were there, we heard the report that they had a manhole, that had collapsed, and they're trying to figure out how to fund it. And then another issue is they knew they had a water leak, but they didn't know where it was. It's just one small town with 2 major problems that we were able to, hear about when we were there at the town meeting. And so it's a situation where even, with the smaller utilities, but it's true with the larger utilities, things are run to failure. And it's a crisis, crisis management type program. So appreciate your interest, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with you as we move forward. So please feel free to call
We
on
have
us.
Another question. Senator Breaux is recognized.
Yeah. Thank you. I apologize for being late, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I had another engagement at 7:30 this morning, so I've been out and about. But so I apologize for not being here for your presentation, the whole part of it, to fully understand. But are you looking at conservation and a resource management? So and the reason I asked this is, as Senator Lising and I were just talking about this, and I was talking about this last evening about how Indiana is fairly flush with water and strong water basins, but other states like California and Arizona are perhaps not managing their water quite as well, and they're looking at in the future probably having to take water from other states and so on and so forth. So is this a part of preserving our waters and making sure that they're clean and that there's conservation involved, or is this just about making sure that the communities have stormwater and wastewater access?
Yeah, the focus on conservation is part of the overall asset management program with the state and with individual utilities. But conservation, and there's been a lot of emphasis on conservation over the years, but one of the things that we feel like is also part of conservation is making sure that we keep the drinking water inside the pipe, as opposed to leakage and non-revenue issues that's associated with water, and also with the sanitary sewer, is making sure that we keep the infiltration inflow out so that we don't overload the treatment plants and end up with an environmental issue. But yes, conservation is a big part of it.
So your focus though is on the infrastructure and the pipes, making sure that the communities have access to water and that it's the pipes are connected and they're not rotten out, so that the water is coming out brown and all that kind of stuff.
A big part of the asset management of utilities has to do with the physical assets.
Physical assets.
But it's a comprehensive program. In other words,
it's physical assets, okay.
Wei had talked about there's 5 major components, the levels of service and understanding the criticality and things like that. But yeah, conservation's a part of it. And we are blessed here in Indiana with, with adequate sources of water, but it still has to be managed properly.
Okay.
Data collection, best practices, technical assistance, asset management plans.
That's it.
Does that kind of sum it up?
That's what it's all about.
Yeah. We have time for one more question, or if not, Senator Breaux, did you have a follow-up? Okay, you had a good question. Anybody else have a question? Well, with that, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for your good work at the center. Yes, Wei.
Okay. Thank you. So the asset management, you mentioned about the large utility and the small utility. Then the large utility, they have the capacity to hire the engineering company come in to develop a very good asset management plan. But the most important thing is what is the end that they follow on, and what we want to create is the statewide standards guidelines for all the utility. They have to obey that. What the data they collect, what the condition assessment they according, and then they make sure not only the local optimized, in the whole state the funding optimized. This is a very an important part for the statewide database and the statewide guidance, I think. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you both for your presentation. Thank you for your good work. Please continue to keep us informed, and we'll be watching. Thank you. Thank you. With that, we'll now turn to House Bill 1417, and Chairman Soliday is recognized to present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for hearing the bill. I will try to be brief. It's a fairly simple bill. This is a companion bill to Senate Bill 9 that we did earlier. The Supreme Court made a decision in March of 2022 that reversed 30 years of standard practice. And basically what retroactive rulemaking is, and according to the statute is, it says that if you suffer a loss as a utility, you can't come in and recover that loss. And on the same way, you cannot, the consumer cannot recover if they made more profit than what was planned. What the court decided to do was take the term cost, which in accounting, you can have lots of costs and still make a profit. A cost does not equal a loss, but that's the position that basically the court took. So for 30 years, Senate Bill 9 dealt with federal mandates. This deals with all kinds of extraordinary circumstances. So an example is if a bad storm, cold front came through, a lot of tornadoes, and we lost a lot of infrastructure. The utility has to go in and fix that right away. Or there might be a state mandate that they need to do engineering and so forth for. In the past, the Financial Standards Accounting Board rules, which apply to every state, say instead of booking that cost as an expense, you can book it as a deferred account. Now, that's accounting. They can do that, their accountants decide that, and it's based upon history and so forth. Then what would happen is the next time you had a CPCN needed or a rate case, then the IURC could say the following deferred accounting things we will fund. You are allowed to recover. Under the court ruling, what happens is and what I would do if I were a utility, it says you have to have pre-approval for everything. It basically knocks out deferred accounting as an IURC tool. So what I would do if I were a utility, and they'll get to testify, I'd go find an example of something similar. I'd get a firm to come in and say, adjust this for inflation, and I'd ask for the biggest number I could ask for, because I don't know what it's going to cost. So this bill is not about the utilities, this is about controlling the utilities. So what we're doing with the bill is taking us back to where we were for 30 years, so that they can use deferred accounting, and then the IURC can use their good judgment of whether it was reasonable and just to allow them to recover that deferred accounting. Now, you can't just lump anything into it, but remember, when we're doing an extraordinary event, we want the lights to come on. So they're going to go out and do work. They're going to get an engineering firm. What does it take to fix this? They're going to get lawyers. They're going to do all that. But they're not going to do it if they don't have pre-approval, because this basically says you can't get a dime of it back. So all we're asking is that we put the system back to the way it was. It worked very well for 30 years. It is a very simple thing. If we don't do this, probably the IURC is here. They can tell you their view of the consequences. So with that, Senator Koch, I'd be glad to answer any questions. We've been over this on 9.
Thank you, Chairman Soliday. Are there questions? Yes, Senator Yoder's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the narrative and explaining the bill. I have actually several questions. So just to clarify, so in the example, you brought up this lawsuit. So Duke, for the last 30 years, has been using deferred accounting practices, has been using this method for coal ash cleanup.
Utilities across America. The coal ash issue really started to merge after their last rate case.
So
In
there
the
was
old
no
day-
coal ash before?
Coal ash issue really, when the Fed ruling came down in 2015, then they had a better idea of what they were going to have to do to comply. So coal ash is one small issue, because we're not, let me be clear, Senator.
Yeah.
They don't get anything out of this. Their case was adjudicated, and it is decided, and they're going down for probably $500 million.
Yes, but you said that this bill is just reversing, just taking us back to how things operated before the Supreme Court decision.
That's correct.
So I was just asking, so what you're saying is Duke has been doing this for coal ash cleanup for the last 30 years?
No, we didn't have a coal ash problem for 30 years. This all emerged, if you track the coal ash thing, when a dam let go and so forth and so on. And then the real action, we had some state action that Duke started to work with, and they booked that. I think that's somewhere between 2005 and so forth. Then the big coal ash stuff started to happen in 2015. 1996, there was no coal ash things that I know of, but there'll be other people who have, I was actually doing something else in 1996.
So on page 2, the list that we are including in 1417, so what's left that a utility wouldn't need pre-approval? That they wouldn't need pre-approval for?
First of all, remember, this only applies to extraordinary events. So normal things, that's why we have rate cases and so forth. These are the things that have always been there. So for me to speculate on what is out there, there are other people more qualified than me. These are the things they have always been able to book in the Phase B and been allowed to recover.
So this is already in Indiana code?
This is the way the code, this is what was allowed under the old system. So whether it is in code, I think we have the IURC here, but these are the things that were always allowed in the past. So whether that is under the appellate court decision and it is common law, or whether that is statutory law, we'll get you an answer before the time is out.
Or maybe it's what, I mean, I would be curious about that, because I wonder if the IURC practiced, there was nothing there wasn't a list this broad, but it was the legal action that now the Supreme Court is saying, that's too broad to put on the backs of ratepayers. That's too much to include. I was just
That's not what the court decision says. It didn't deal with the
It didn't say
detail
you
of it.
can't do that.
It said, very simple decision. It said, you're not allowed to do retroactive, and we have defined retroactive rate making as anything that isn't pre-approved. They didn't go into any lists, none of that was done. So,
It wasn't pre-approved.
yes. They said, we don't care what it is, if it's not pre-approved, you can't recover.
And then on page 3 of the bill, now, I granted we have an amendment, but that we were looking at. I thought I saw an amendment.
The amendment will not be offered. It was a
It was a
technical issue.
technical
Yeah.
correction, and that just slows the bill up, so.
On bottom of page 3, can you, I would just like to, in real terms, how would lines 34 through 40, using the current Duke case as an example, what would this mean?
What would it mean?
You're saying that for the Duke case, it doesn't apply. They're going to pay their $500 million.
That's correct.
But going forward, this is what's going to
This
happen.
is what will happen in the future.
Okay, and then I think I have one more question, and then I'll be quiet. Well, maybe that's it for now.
Well, let me, because I'll be before you more times this year, and heaven knows what they will do. They can appeal things, they can do all kinds of things. This doesn't give them a free pass at any stretch.
And the thing that, we've pushed off distributive energies and net metering because it was, at the time, it was going through the courts. And coming in and doing 1417, does seem counter to what we have said in the past. And you can speak to that. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But why do we need 1417 after the amended Senate Bill 9?
Senate Bill 9 only applies to federal mandates. This applies to all extraordinary exceptions. So, Senator Koch, and we heavily subsidized, rooftop solar with net metering. And we gave it 5 years. We have 6,800 homes in the whole state that use rooftop solar, 6,800. So we can buy all the renewable energy we want for about 20% of what we were paying for rooftop. That's grandma, not the state. That's what we were paying. So what we said was, we're going to let it expire. And what the law says is now if you have rooftop solar, you get 25% over wholesale, which is a better deal than anybody gets. So this is a question that of policy of the state, which we're supposed to set, not the court. So that was a question of policy of the state. We went over it and over it and over it, and we decided we were not going to do net metering. I will be honest with you, if the court had not decided the way they decided, Senator Koch and I would have been in here to do just what we're doing here, because we do not believe it's fair to the ratepayer to have them subsidize people with rooftop solar. We're already doing it for 25% over wholesale and significantly more than we can buy renewals from commercial sites.
But can you answer my question about the conversation about just waiting until it moves to the courts? That question.
Because it was in the courts, and one of the reasons we did 9 is the Senate has a rule that no legislation while there is litigation pending. And Senator Koch is, we have it very, very loose in the House, but the Senate is fairly black and white. If there is pending litigation, no legislation. There are loopholes, but Senator Koch, you know better than I do how that works. And so 9, if the IURC had, at that moment, 5 cases backed up, and they were saying, what do we do? What are we supposed to do with this? We have no idea what to do, and more coming. If we had not, Duke was going to file an appeal. I mean, I don't know that for certain, but if I were there, I would file an appeal. That appeal would have to be filed by the 26th of March. So we did 9 so we could get through the Senate rules and get the legislation moving, because no telling how long the court's going to deal with that appeal. So the IURC can't sit there for 2 years and go, what should we do? Because almost everything before the IURC is on a shot clock. When you file, it's got to be done by X.
Okay, well, I'll listen and maybe have a few more questions, but for now, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Yoder. Further questions for the bill's author? All right, thank you, Chairman Soliday. We will now move to testimony. Chair recognizes Danielle McGrath and Nick Kyle, representing the Indiana Energy Association.
Chairman Koch, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today in support of House Bill 1417. My name is Danielle McGrath, and I am president of the Indiana Energy Association, representing 14 investor-owned electric and natural gas utilities. So as we've learned today, this is a bill about accounting treatment, and it's an important one at that. It puts into place a framework that is consistent with decades of regulatory practice in Indiana, which we've heard about, as well as many other states. And this is important because that framework no longer exists as it once did, which has resulted in a tremendous amount of uncertainty for everyone involved. For us, this is a bill about procedure and the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission's authority to review and make decisions about costs associated with serving our customers. For a utility company, a cost can only be deferred if it complies with detailed accounting standards. These principles are well established and strictly adhered to by the company's accounting and legal professionals, both inside as well as outside the company. As such, there are several important elements to this bill that I would like to further touch on and explain today. The first is that the IURC maintains the full discretion and must find the expenses to be reasonable and prudent before any deferred costs are included in rates. Just because a utility determines it's appropriate to create a regulatory asset does not mean that those expenses will actually be approved. Second, this is truly about going back to how things were. For example, the list of costs on page 2, which Senator Yoder, you had mentioned, those are all consistent with prior practice. And so the bill today does not authorize anything that has not been brought before the IURC before. And the same is true for pre-approval. It was never a requirement of before because that's exactly how accounting standards work. And plus, it's impractical in some situations. Lastly, this bill does follow the Supreme Court opinion that redefined the concept of retroactive rate making, but it does not impact the underlying decision because that case is now closed. I'll also note that deferred accounting isn't limited to just expenses, and this is important. It has been used by the IURC to also capture reductions in costs, such as federal tax decreases that would otherwise not be reflected in customer rates, but for this accounting treatment. So in conclusion, we do appreciate the author addressing this important issue to bring clarity back to the regulatory practice and restore a framework that has worked for so long. So with that being said, I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have. I also have counsel here with me today, Nick Kyle, should there be any legal questions directed to him.
Thank you, Danielle. Questions for either Danielle or Nick? Senator Yoder is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Danielle. Can you give us or give me some examples of what you use regulatory assets for, and how much in regulatory assets do you currently have on the books that you intend to seek recovery for through the IURC?
Oh, I wouldn't have that information. So it's always going to be dependent on each utility's unique situation. So these are not routine expenses. This is for something out of the norm. And so before they decide to do anything, they have to consult with their internal experts, as I mentioned, accountants and attorneys, to see whether or not this would qualify. And that's based on precedent, prior commission decisions, a number of different factors before anything can actually be booked that way. And so that would be a company by company question.
But if we have had this broad list of exceptions, because what I hear you saying is the IURC would hear that in the rate-making case and take into account all of those. And it just so happens in the 2015 case, the Supreme Court then in the legal action said, not the coal ash. You can't retroactively put that onto the backs of ratepayers. And so the fact that we're now listing out, it sort of takes away nuance. It takes away what is reasonable and prudent for the IRC to take into account in these rate-making cases where we can take testimony and hear from all different stakeholders in the rate-making case. But we're kind of saying we're not going to listen. We're just going to say all of these, this very pre-approved list, as a state, we're going to allow all of these, and it takes away any nuance, or it takes away the power of the people to be able to have a say in that rate-making case, because it's saying we're going to approve all of these. These are in code. Can you speak to that?
Yes, I can, and thank you very much for the question. It's actually almost the reverse of what you're suggesting, because without the bill, with the decision that came from the Supreme Court, there would be no ability for the commission to decide whether a deferred cost should be recovered. And we have to remember there are a couple of things that are in this bill that are really important, that are the kind of protections you're talking about. First is at the very top of line 2, where it says the recognition of regulatory assets that are in effect at the time. It's talking about the accounting standard for the regulatory, for the recognition of that regulatory asset. Well, that accounting standard is that it's an extraordinary cost that is probable of recovery once it comes before a commission. So we're not talking about just any financing cost. We're talking about some extraordinary event that accountants can look at, and they can look at past precedents, and they can say, based upon the way this has been handled in the past, that's probable of recovery, and so that's why we can put it in the regulatory asset. And then when you come down on that same page to line 22, found to be reasonable and prudent by the commission. And so there's another backstop for the commission to review that and make certain that they believe and find that cost to be reasonable and prudent. So there really are two elements in that statute that say, all right, if it is one of these types of costs, we can consider whether it's recoverable as a commission, rather than, and so the list is there to just make sure that it's all encompassing in terms of what can be considered. But it's those two line items. It's appropriate for the recognition of a regulatory asset, and it's reasonable and prudent, that provides the protection and puts that decision in the hands of the regulatory commission.
Thank you. So what is left that the utility won't need pre-approval for? So what's left?
Well,
Salaries?
It should be all-encompassing to those two elements. It's got to be reasonable and prudent, and it's got to be appropriate for the recognition of a regulatory asset. Salaries would not be appropriate for the recognition of a regulatory asset under the accounting standards.
So I'm sorry. So what's not included that can't in this pre-approved list? That you wouldn't need pre-approval for?
I don't know that I can identify for you what's not included. What is included are costs, the types of costs that are likely to be incurred in the event of something extraordinary that have to be incurred and are of the type of costs that we can say, more likely than not, would be recoverable in the regulatory environment.
It reads that the list is so broad that it includes everything. So everything would be able to be pre-approved. And so it to me, and I'm going to listen to everybody, it feels like, why do we even need a rate-making case?
Well, that's for what the commission's for. They're the ones who get to decide that. Under the Supreme Court case, they're not. That's the difference. This is putting that decision, this is putting that review in the hands of the regulatory commission.
I hear what you're saying. I'm understanding it the opposite. It's kind of like upside down day, but I'm going to thank you for explaining. I'll continue to try to figure it out.
Senator Breaux is recognized.
Just two things. First of all, I just think it's laughable that you put all this emphasis on the IURC. I don't know when the IURC has ever said no to a request for a rate increase. And Dan, you're nodding your head.
No, I
think it's very rare. It seems to be very rare.
I would disagree with that.
You would disagree with that? Well, okay. Well, then we'll just have to get the data and take a look at that. But it sounds laughable to me. But can you just tell me, I don't understand yet. Everyone keeps referencing this taking us back to where we were before. Can you just explain the lawsuit very simply and very succinctly that everyone is discussing?
Certainly. In a nutshell, Duke incurred costs in relationship to cleaning up an ash pond.
I'm kind of familiar with that background.
And its accountants made the determination that under the accounting standards, those costs were properly deferred because they were probable of recovery from the commission, because they were unforeseen, they were extraordinary costs, and they made that determination. And they came in for a rate case, and the commission agreed with them and found these costs were prudently incurred, they were properly deferred under the accounting standards, and approved the recovery. And the Court of Appeals agreed with them when it went up on appeal. And then the Supreme Court came out with its decision and said because they had been incurred in the past, don't care that they were reasonably and prudently incurred, don't care that they were properly deferred under the accounting standards, they're not recoverable as retroactive rate making. So that's what the Supreme Court decision held.
And one of the components to that decision was that Duke did not get pre-approval for the expenses, and they wanted to then, because they made the decision, did not go before anybody for pre-approval, and then wanted to attach those rates to their ratepayers for a decision that they needed to get some kind of approval. So does this, so when we're taking it back to where we were, are we dismissing the pre-approval process and removing that altogether?
I don't think you're removing it altogether. Frequently, costs that are incurred, and I think Chairman Soliday mentioned a storm, like an
So
extreme,
extraordinary, except.
like an extreme storm comes through.
Okay.
You're going to incur those costs before you could even go get pre-approval to incur those costs. And so there's no opportunity to get that approval before you incur them. Frequently, those are the types of costs that we're talking about.
So then what we're saying here is that they're under extraordinary circumstances. If you, as a utility, have to make an outlay of cash to address this extraordinary circumstances, you will not need to go before the IURC to get approval to pass those rates on to the ratepayer. You will instead be able to, where does the retroactivity come in?
Well, there is no retroactivity because if you incur the costs before you've brought it before the commission, you're going to come in later for a review of those costs.
And so if the IURC determines that those costs are reasonable and prudent, then
Yes.
you will have, so it will be okay that you have already made those costs and already planned to pass those costs down to your ratepayers.
If the IRC makes two determinations. Number one, they've got to determine that it's reasonable and prudent. Number two, they have to find that those costs were properly deferred under the accounting standards, which that's what separates this from ordinary routine expenses, because not just anything can be deferred under the accounting standards.
So it's a storm.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other extraordinary exceptions?
Well, one was mentioned a few moments ago. There was a few years ago, there was a significant cut in the income tax rate that the IURC came in and ordered everyone after that had taken effect to defer those savings, which were ultimately passed on to customers. That's an example.
Okay, that's a savings. That's a good example to put forth.
I mean, that legislation passed.
I get it. So essentially, this is an end run around the IURC in advance of an expenditure made by a utility that they are going to then ask the ratepayers to pay.
I would
You would
quarrel with the
disagree.
word end run.
Yeah, I know.
Because there wasn't a requirement of that before the Supreme Court decision.
Okay, I got you.
All right, thank you for the questions. Thank you for your testimony. Was there another? I want to note that we have to be upstairs by noon, so we're going to conclude our work on this bill by. Oh, that's okay. I'm not discouraging questions, but I am going to do is go through the next 3 witnesses who are signed up. We'll take testimony only. Then we'll come back and do questions that could be directed to any witness. So we have the opportunity to get those questions in. So our next witness will be, you're welcome, Kerwin Olson on behalf of Citizens Action Coalition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Chairman Soliday, Kerwin Olson, CAC. We do rise in opposition to House Bill 1417. It would be unfair of me to not express our gratitude to Chairman Soliday for a second reading amendment that was placed on the bill, which did directly speak to concerns that he and I discussed in House Utilities that did improve the bill. So I do want to thank Chairman Soliday for that. However, we remain opposed to the bill despite that change. First, I would note there's nothing in the bill that speaks to off-nominal events, extraordinary circumstances, unforeseen events. That would bring consumer advocates some comfort if with regulatory assets we're talking about extraordinary events, off-nominal events. Let's say that. Let's put that in the bill, especially as Senator Yoder has noted with the extraordinary list of recoverable expenses. If regulatory assets are about off-nominal events, then let's say so. Let's say so. You know, we also look at this bill from a macro perspective and not necessarily a micro perspective, because we've been talking a lot about utilities for the last 10 or 15 years in this building. And you know, first I would note that, you know, one of those conversations was Senate Bill 251 in 2011, the federal mandate statute, which everybody was well aware. We crafted out of concern about updated regulations coming from the Obama administration, including the coal ash rule. We knew there was a coal ash rule coming. Coal ash rule wasn't finalized till 2015. Part of that rule was, you know, pre-approval. The coal ash rule required, you know, a plan approved by IDEM, EPA, pre-approval from the commission to recover those costs. You read the Supreme Court opinion, you read the lower court opinion, it says Duke could have asked for pre-approval and they chose not to. And again, this is about coal ash. You know, the cases before the courts are not about storm damage or floods or fires. They're about coal ash. And we're also talking, as Chairman Soliday noted, about $500 million here. And we still have a lot of coal ash to clean up, a lot. And consumer advocates like CAC are very concerned that when you look at Senate Bill 9, Senate Enrolled Act 9, removing that pre-approval requirement, added on top of limiting oversight, if you will, with respect to regulatory assets, we're talking about a lot of dough. You know, we all know and understand. You can characterize it either way you want. Some say Indiana has lost its competitive advantage with respect to energy costs, utility costs. We prefer to say we've got an affordability crisis. We're all saying the same thing. And when I say a macro level, CAC believes strongly that this is less about resources in coal and gas and wind and solar and more about regulatory oversight. Because what we have done in this building, in our opinion, is looked at all these micro issues and systematically reduced commission oversight and regulation of these investor-owned utilities that has led to extraordinary increases in water, wastewater, gas, and electric bills. Senate Bill 251, federal mandate statute. They now have a tracker for that stuff. Transmission, distribution, they have a tracker for that. Tracker for efficiency, tracker for fuel costs, trackers for power purchase contracts. The list goes on and on. You know, and this is also understanding that now that we're starting to see some data from the utilities in any given month, you know, 250,000 plus Hoosiers receive disconnect notices in their mailboxes, and that's not counting water and wastewater. We know folks are struggling. We know folks are hurting. Ratepayers need a break. Ratepayers deserve a break. Ratepayers deserve some sense and confidence that this building and the regulatory process is here to protect them from the excesses of investor-owned monopolies. We all want financially healthy utilities. Of course we do. Of course we do. But we beg this committee to reject this bill, look at the bigger picture and understand what's going into utility bills in Indiana, and that is reduced oversight, more flexibility for the utilities, less flexibility for the commission. Please, let's start a new path. Let's consider consumers and monthly utility bills as we talk about public policy and what the needs are for that public policy, which is protecting the public interest, and that's constituents, small businesses struggling to pay their bills. This will only exacerbate that. This doesn't help customers. And with that, I thank you for your time.
And we thank you for your testimony. This time, Chair recognizes Joe Rumpala, representing the Indiana Industrial Energy Consumers, known as INDIAC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like Kerwin, I'd like to begin by thanking Chairman Soliday and Chairman Koch for their open communication and commitment to the stakeholder process regarding this legislation, and acknowledging their efforts and willingness to take and hear from many, including INDIAC, their concerns with this legislation. But in spite of those efforts, INDIAC was and remains opposed to 1417 because we are profoundly concerned, as you all should be, with the consequences of this bill. To help clarify it a little bit, this legislation stems from a decision by the Indiana Supreme Court that was issued in March of 2022, which arose out of a rate case and a dispute over whether or not Duke Energy could recover from ratepayers over $200 million in costs that it deferred associated with environmental remediation. Duke incurred those costs over the better part of a decade, beginning in 2010, without having sought any form of pre-approval from the Commission, without having taken advantage of any of the available tracking mechanisms, including the FMCA, and it would have allowed for recovery of those, and it did so, without seeking to adjust its rates at any time between 2004 and 2019. Despite the efforts of Duke and the IURC to frame the issue before the Supreme Court as one of deference and one of accounting, at stake was really a pure legal question, something that falls clearly within the expertise of the Supreme Court. Did the Commission's order violate the recovery, the statutory authorization of the IURC by allowing recovery of costs as retroactive rate making? A statute or a rule which is embedded in Indiana Code 81268. So make no mistake, the legislation before you, providing that notwithstanding Section 68, a utility may recover deferred costs, would eliminate that rule and the basic ratepayer protections it provides, and that have been in statute for over 100 years, and that have been enforced by Indiana courts since at least the 1950s. The rule is fundamental to ensuring that monopoly utilities operate like competitive businesses between their rate proceedings. It ensures that they are incentivized to operate efficiently, requiring them to manage their costs and their revenues or to seek rate relief. It does this by forcing them to maintain cost discipline, by putting the risk on the utilities to manage their revenues and expenses, knowing that they simply cannot go back and recover excess expenses in future rate cases. And as Chairman Soliday pointed out, the rule against retroactive rate making is a two-way street. It doesn't just apply to utilities, it prevents customers from going and saying the utility earned too much. Some of you are business owners, like myself, and you understand the business risk. You understand that sometimes your expenses exceed your budgets. And in those cases, you have some options. You can accept a lower profit for that year. You can work to increase your revenues. You can defer other investments. And maybe it turns out that you have a decrease in another form of expense that offsets it. And that happens to utilities. But what you cannot do and what is go back to your customers and say, I need to charge you a little more because what I already sold you costs more than I expected. You can't do that because the competitive market prevents you from doing it. And for over 100 years, Indiana law has stated that regulated monopolies cannot do it either. But if you pass this legislation, you will radically change that law and permit exactly that sort of behavior. Because the legislation will give the utilities the absolute ability to unilaterally decide whether or not to defer costs, and therefore have no incentive to control those costs because they will be guaranteed not only the recovery of those costs, but a return on those capitalized expenses, so long as the commission later finds them to be reasonable and prudent. In short, it offers a way around any sort of pre-approval or pre-examination process and takes away the incentive to control costs. Now, INDIAC is not blind to the practical realities imposed by the rule of retroactive rate making or the Indiana Supreme Court's decision. There are truly exigent circumstances, what Senator or Representative Soliday has sometimes referred to as off-nominal events, which may necessitate deferral of a cost such as the restoration costs after a major storm that far exceeds the storm damage expense built into utilities rates. And if this bill were truly aimed only at those exigent circumstances, those situations could be addressed with far more precision and without doing the fundamental rule of utility regulation as HB 1417 does. For example, it could retain a pre-approval requirement, making an exception for those costs incurred as a result of extraordinary and unforeseen events, or making an exception for rate case expense. These would limit the impact of the bill, conform it to existing practice, and preserve an important ratepayer protection in most instances. HB 1417 does not restore prior practice. Utilities have had the same accounting options and the same pre-approval mechanisms in the form of trackers and even coming in for pre-approval cases before the commission that they had in March of 2022, prior to the Supreme Court's decision. Instead, the bill upends a basic principle of law that has been long embedded in Indiana statute, in which would free utilities from their part of the regulatory bargain, which is to maintain and act in a manner to prudently invest their revenues in order to provide the best and most efficient service possible to their consumer. INDIAC asks you to vote no on 1417 and to shield ratepayers from the unbalanced approach that exposes ratepayers to rate increases when deferred assets are used to pile on added costs on top of those forecasted in their rate cases. Thank you. And in light of the commission chairman, I will not take questions now.
But stick around. There may be some later. Thanks, Joe, for your testimony.
Thank you, sir.
The next witness is Steve Croney with Citizens Energy Group.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Steve Croney. I'm an attorney with Ice Miller, and I'm testifying today on behalf of the water and wastewater utilities of Citizens Energy Group and Indiana American in support of HB 1417, which the language, HB 1417 preserves the status quo with respect to deferred accounting practices in Indiana. The language in the recent Supreme Court decision that we've been talking about could be interpreted as making any consideration of what has been forever a properly deferred cost retroactive rate making in a future case. That's a significant departure from past rate making practices in Indiana. On a going forward basis, HB 1417 treats deferred cost accounting practice as they have been for more than 30 years. HB 1417 doesn't get rid of the rule against retroactive rate making. That rule still exists. Deferral of certain costs in accordance with applicable accounting standards has always been a recognized exception to the rule against retroactive rate making, with recovery in rates allowed only so long as the IURC determines the costs that are deferred are reasonable and prudent. HB 1417 preserves that process and specifically provides that the utility cannot recover deferred cost unless they are subsequently found by the IURC to be reasonable and prudent. The list of all the costs that are included in HB 1417 are just the list of costs. Those costs cannot be recovered, none of them, unless the commission finds they're reasonable and prudent. Importantly, accounting rules for utilities are different from the accounting rules of a regular business, and they're required to be followed by the utilities. One of those rules is FASB, or Financial Accounting Standard Board 980, which provides that a utility should capitalize as a regulatory asset for future recovery costs that are extraordinary in nature and that are likely to be recovered. So if there's a probable corresponding rate increase, they're required to capitalize and defer those costs. And determining whether a future increase in recoverability is probable, one way, but not the only way to do that, has been to obtain commission pre-approval. And in some cases, utilities do go in for commission pre-approval and have done that in the past before deferring cost. But that's deferral or commission pre-approval has never been required to capitalize a deferred cost for future recovery in Indiana. The commission has always allowed utilities to defer costs for future recovery in reliance on previous orders or opinions of their counsel and accountants that the costs are likely to be recovered in the future. In fact, the IURC has in some cases made it clear that it's the role of the utility and their accountants to determine which costs can be deferred, but then it's the commission's role after that deferral happens to decide whether they can be recovered in rates. And again, in cases where commissions allowed recovery of deferred capitalized assets, the traits are they're infrequently incurred. The assets involve significant and long-lasting benefits to the rate payers, and they involve significant costs to the point where it's prudent to smooth those costs out gradually over time. Again, these are infrequently incurred costs that are significant. It's not about just overspending on a normal revenue requirement, like overspending on salaries. These are sort of significant, unexpected events that couldn't be planned for. In the water and wastewater community, examples of cases where the commission might approve recovery of a deferred asset could include a case where a utility is required to incur a substantial engineering cost to prepare a plan to present to the commission to replace or upgrade a water treatment plant or wastewater treatment plant to meet environmental regulations or an environmental violation. HB 1417 preserves this longstanding model and maintains the requirement that the IURC must scrutinize these deferred costs and find they're reasonable and prudent before they're reflected in rates. HB 1417 recognizes the practical reality of utility planning, which requires that costs often must be incurred before they can be presented to the commission, requiring utilities to seek pre-approval of costs needed to address events like emergency response or complying with environmental or other governmental mandates is disruptive to utility operations, potentially threatens public safety, and creates costs to be borne by ratepayers that are avoidable. The public's best served by utilities incurring necessary costs first, then bringing them before the commission after the issue has been addressed, and then the commission will determine whether they can be recovered by looking to determine whether they're prudent and reasonable.
All right, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to recognize Luke Wilson from the IURC as a resource for committee questions, and I have one. Luke, can you comment, if you can, on Mr. Olson's concern that nothing in the bill limits it to off-nominal events?
Yeah, so Luke Wilson, Legislative Director for the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. And I will say before I begin, Mr. Chairman, I'm sort of going to be limited because I'm neither an attorney nor an accountant, and there are some pending cases before the commission with deferred costs.
And we will, for the record, recognize that.
Okay.
Certainly, we're not asking you to.
So in regards to, so I guess I'd point to three aspects in the bill. Number one, for when the utility is trying to defer these costs on page 1, line 13, these costs need to be sort of incurred in a regulatory asset consistent with the accounting rules, and moving on to page 2, that the recognition of the regulatory assets that are in effect at the time the deferral decision is made. So the utility has to comply with the accounting rules in the time of effect. The accounting standard is ASC 980-340-25-1, which sort of governs that. And if you're essentially a public company, you need to follow the accounting rules in line. Otherwise, your investors would get mad about that, and you'd be violating those regulations. And then also, so you have to comply with the accounting rules to defer. And then going down to page 2, what's been talked about a lot is that the commission needs to find that on lines 21 and 22, that the deferral under this section was made in accounting rules and that those costs were found to be reasonable and prudent. So again, before any cost goes to ratepayers, the commission has to approve those costs through an order to change those rates. So I hope that answered your question.
All right, it does. Thank you. Senator Hunley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Luke. So just a question. We keep talking about the pre-approval process. How long does that typically take for IURC to pre-approve?
I don't have the stats in front of me. As I understand it, again, from a non-attorney, non-accountant background, a utility has always had the option under the deferred accounting standard consistent with prior practice with the commission to seek pre-approval. And the reason that you'd seek pre-approval is to reduce the risk that the IURC would deny those recovery of those costs after if you didn't seek pre-approval. So you can defer those costs if it's with the accounting rules, as a previous witness had mentioned. That's a decision between the utility and their accountants. However, if they don't seek that pre-approval, they're running a greater risk of the commission looking at that when the utility comes in to get recovery for those deferred costs, that the commission will deny it, where seeking pre-approval sort of grants a greater level of certainty that the commission will find those costs reasonable approved because they pre-approved it.
So then kind of to a question that Senator Breaux had asked earlier, then how often does the IURC deny these types of requests?
Yeah, so I have 2 pre-approval denials that I pulled previously from sort of cases that I can quote here for you. One was COVID. So the utilities had come in and asked for pre-approval to defer a variety of costs related to the COVID pandemic. The OUCC, Office of Utility Consumer Counsel, the state agency that represents ratepayers in the state, have asked for a more limited scope of deferral for cost. The commission ultimately found, and this is in cause number 45380, the commission ultimately found that it would allow deferral on for costs related to impacts directly associated with any prohibition on utility disconnections, collection of certain utility fees like late fees, convenience fees, deposits, and reconnection fees, and the use of expanded payment arrangements, as well as any COVID-19 related uncollectible and incremental bad debt expenses. The commission denied the utility's pre-approval request for regulatory accounting authority or deferred costs for operational maintenance expenses, financing costs, pension expenses, and lost revenues related to customer load reductions from the pandemic. So that's one example.
So the assumption there would be that that those elements that were denied weren't extraordinary in any way because they would have been typical costs that would have been incurred.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a specific line I highlight here. Consequently, while the COVID-19 pandemic may be an extraordinary event, we find we lack sufficient evidence at this time to determine what, if any, extraordinary treatment is warranted beyond the limited relief requested by the OUCC. One more example I'd like to point out really quickly is actually dealing with the storm issues, so extraordinary storms. They truly have to be extraordinary, almost worst case scenario storms. So in this one, this is an old Duke Energy request for deferred accounting related to an ice storm that happened. And ultimately, I say in the order the commission says, although the commission's noted other jurisdictions has found an exception to the general prohibition for past expenses flowing from an extraordinary storm, it's rejected in the past at the time PSI Public Service Indiana, Duke's predecessor, the request for such relief because the evidence presented did not demonstrate that the storm was extraordinary enough to merit such an exception. And then the commission in this order for this particular ice storm says that the ice storm at issue in this proceeding was not an extraordinary storm that warrants an exception to the prohibition against retroactive and single-issue rate making. So there have been multiple times in the past where the commission has denied deferred accounting requests from utilities.
That's helpful.
That storms truly have to be extraordinary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lysing is recognized, and then Senator Breaux.
Just a quick question. When you look at 1417 as we see it today, knowing that what we had prior to the court ruling, do you think that there's any significant expansion of language in 1417 beyond what we had before the court ruling?
That's where I run into, I am not the attorney and probably not qualified to say. I will say the commission would appreciate the discretion to continue to be able to consider just petitions that are brought before it.
I think that question may be answered in the commission's brief before the Court of Appeals. So I think it would state
a fair answer that the commission was a party to the case and did submit briefs to both the Court of Appeals and the Indiana Supreme Court supporting our decision to allow the deferred accounting.
And I recognize that the commission has obviously the right to approve or not approve. So, I mean, I guess part of that question that might be in some people's minds would have to do with, can the commission stand up strong and say no if they need to? And you just gave us some examples. So.
Thank you, Senator Lysing. Senator Breaux, and then Senator Yoder.
Thank you. So the lawsuit was about the disposal of coal ash. Are you familiar with?
I mean, I want to be very tread on carefully here because I'm not an attorney. I'm not qualified to sort of. I don't want to offer an expert opinion. On this
it was. It's my understanding that Duke had this coal ash. They were, I guess, the feds were coming down. Is that correct, Senator Cook? The feds were coming down with some requirement that they had to address the disposal of coal ash. So and there is still a requirement for any kind. Now, where does the pre-approval process? So if I'm Duke, I have coal ash, I need to get rid of it. It's going to cost me millions of dollars. I'm just going to go ahead and charge that to my customer. Right now, and then, did they have to come in for a rate case at that time?
Duke, in that scenario or example you gave, could not charge their customers anything until they get an order from the commission.
Until they get an order from the commission.
Yes, but they could defer those costs, and that gets into the accounting.
So they can defer the costs, which means that they're going to wait before they come to. They're going to make the investment. But the pre-approval is all about making sure, and you said this, mitigating the risk that the investment they make is going to be approved for recovery by the IURC. So to defer it means to go before the IURC to make sure that whatever they defer, they can get recovered.
Yeah, so I guess let me take a step back. So again, the deferral decision is the utilities itself. So whether they decide to defer those costs and put it into a regulatory asset is almost a purely financial accounting decision. The decision to then seek recovery, they have to come to the commission. They can't charge their ratepayers anything before the commission allows them to change their rates.
And so this is supposedly about extraordinary exceptions. The initial lawsuit was around the disposal of coal ash. Is that an extraordinary exception? Because you all approved their ability to recover the cost, which sent this up to the Supreme Court, which disagreed with you and said, no, you can't recover that. So how did you consider that a extraordinary circumstance, or was that requirement not in place at the time that Duke made this initial?
I think extraordinary costs are used a lot because it's a great example of when deferred accounting or creating a regulatory asset is necessary. I think a previous witness had also mentioned that oftentimes utilities will use deferred accounting for rate case expenses, for example. So again, deferred accounting is simply creating sort of a regulatory asset on your balance sheet while you incur costs on the other side.
And I understand that, but my question is, Duke came to the IURC seeking approval of their deferred costs for the disposal of coal ash. IURC said it's okay. The Supreme Court disagreed with the IURC and said, no, Duke, you can't recover those costs, and you have to take the hit yourselves, the $2.5 billion or whatever it is, that's going to be on you. So the IURC was asked, and they agreed with Duke. So my question is there disposal of coal ash something that is considered an extraordinary off-nominal expense that is eligible to receive cost? Do you all agree with that? And is that a standard that you use for all cases? So therefore, anyone else? And I guess, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the board. Let me just ask this one. I'm going to try to sum it up. So with this bill, does the IURC still have to be approached in advance of deferring any cost? Does the IURC still need to be a part of the approval process in advance of them making the decision? Or are you now out of the picture?
What the bill does on the commission's not out of the picture. What the bill does is says that on page 2, lines 15 and 16, pre-approval is not required for the creation of a regulatory asset. That does not preclude a utility, again, as I mentioned earlier, from asking for pre-approval. So utility can still come for pre-approval.
But they don't have to.
Right, and as previous witness.
So what's the likelihood that they really would if they don't have to? What's the incentive to make them come in?
As I mentioned earlier, it's the greater certainty that they will get recovery from the commission.
And you approve things like the disposal of coal ash. So what's to make them think that anything that is deferred would not be approved by the IURC?
So it's a great point, because one of the parts of the regulatory or the accounting rule for regulatory accounting is that essentially that you have prior precedents to rely on to show that recovery is likely. So utility, if they're following the accounting rules, cannot or shouldn't, and again, I'm not an accountant, so this is how I understand it, so please keep that in mind, but the utility cannot or should not be deferring a cost if they don't have decisions to look back to and said, oh, a commission in the state we're operating in approved this in this previous circumstance, and those match up.
And the only example that you used, which was an extraordinary exception, was COVID. Everything else, it seems, has been approved. So if you're using that, if you're using precedent to use in determining whether or not it's a recoverable, the only precedent you have is something which truly is an extraordinary event.
Well, I mean, other than the sort of the rate case expenses and other things previously mentioned that have been approved in the past. But so much focus happens on the extraordinary events because it's a good example to highlight how deferred accounting works and why it's.
Well, and I apologize for.
Okay, good discussion, and I encourage you to carry that conversation on as the bill moves forward. We are running close on time, but I do want to give Senator Yoder and Senator Perfect just a time to ask a brief question. Then we'll have Representative Soliday close.
Thank you. Does your example that you used demonstrate that pre-approval is a good thing in protecting ratepayers?
I mean, it certainly can be in that, but again, this idea that it's just about whether or not those deferred costs are found to be reasonable and prudent, just when that, again, so when a utility comes in for pre-approval, they're saying, hey, we want to defer this, are you okay with that? And that's sort of, it's giving them greater certainty that when those deferred costs will be approved later, the utility could still defer those costs, they're just taking greater risk that they won't be approved. And if they're not approved, ratepayers don't pay for them. So it's sort of,
I could say something like, or just come in and we'll write a new piece of code to make it so. But number two, would the IRC have to approve, given your examples, if 1417 were in place, would you have to approve the examples you provided?
the IURC under 1417, again, under that sort of page 2 line, clause D from line 17, has to approve those costs, the deferred costs, in order for those to be recovered
So in the
rates.
examples that you provided?
You mean the ice storm in COVID?
Yeah.
So again, that was sort of the utility coming in for pre-approval and the commission saying, we'll approve these costs, but not these costs. Okay. The bill says they do not have to come in for pre-approval. It does not preclude them from doing that, though.
But why, it doesn't preclude them, but they don't have to come in for pre-approval. And you're saying it just provides some extra protection, but extra protection from what?
But not extra certainty that
Okay,
recovery
extra
will happen.
certainty
Yeah.
that the recovery will come, but who would say you can't do that? What would
Can't do
be
what?
the mechanism that would the IRC then go back and say, oh, you can't?
Yeah, I mean,
recoup that cost?
even if they came in for pre-approval and something was unreasonable or not prudent, the commission could deny that.
If they didn't come in for pre-approval, because
If
it's saying
they didn't come in for pre-approval, they would come in essentially during their next rate case to ask for those recovery of deferred costs. The IURC would look at those deferred costs and see, are they reasonable and are they prudent? If the answer is, and under this bill, were they deferred in accordance with the accounting rules? If the answer is no to any of those, that recovery would presumably be denied.
But isn't that the exact process that we just went through?
With?
Because there was coal ash, Duke came in for a rate case, or well, they addressed the coal ash issue and put those costs onto the ratepayer, did not get pre-approval. And then there was a lawsuit, and they said, you can't do that. Didn't Duke come in since then, in 2019, have another rate case, and did not ask for pre-approval again on the coal ash? And they lost again in this last February ruling?
So I'm leaning more into the territory. I want to be very hesitant because it's sort of a legal interpretation. I thought the Supreme Court case was about the 2019 rate case and sort of centered on Duke requesting the recovery of those deferred costs in the 2019 rate case. I guess I have the opinion, but which I can give you. I guess we can talk afterwards, given the time restraints.
That would be fine. Senator Perfect is recognized, and then Chairman Soliday to close on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to sort of take this in a little bit different direction, maybe a little bit more broad and a little bit more simple. So I generally say, as it relates to the legislature, we really are always dealing with just two things here. Who's in charge and who pays? Almost every bill comes down to those two things. So my first question is, who's in charge? And it's been interesting. There were some comparisons made between how people run their business and this space we're in. It's been fascinating for me to hear about how utilities operate. But sounds to me like, generally speaking, in Indiana, who's in charge is the IURC.
When it comes to setting rates, yes.
Yeah.
The IURC is the economic regulator of each sort of public utility in the state
Yeah,
that's under its
so-
jurisdiction.
So the parallel between that and private business is not great, as is the case on who pays. You know, one of the things that Senator Leising talks about a lot, as do the rest of us, a big concern is reliability. We talked about broadband, we talked about water. I would say on the scale of things, the expectation is when you flip the switch, the power comes on, and if it doesn't, people freak out pretty well. So one of your charges is to make sure that when you turn the switch, the power comes on.
Correct, yeah.
so
The
that's-
sort of charter is safe and reliable service at just and reasonable rates.
Yeah, outstanding. So on the subject of who pays, and I don't know, a couple of things I'm going to talk about here are sort of somewhere between irony and hypocrisy, and I'm not sure where the line is, but in terms of who pays, it seems to me like there's only three choices. It is the ratepayer himself, themselves, the person who's flipping the switch and wants the power to come on. Generally, they pay. Number two, the assertion has been that they shouldn't pay, but maybe the investors in the company should pay. Am I not correct in that in this highly regulated space, the people in charge, you, put a cap on how much they can make on the upside? So you limit the amount of money that the investor-owned utilities can make on the upside.
Yeah, they're sort of, their rates are set based on their revenue requirements.
Yes, but they're also limited on the return that they can receive to what you believe to be prudent.
Yeah, I mean, the rates are set, so depending on how much, in this example, electricity they are able to sell would then determine their revenue, but the rates are set by the commission.
But in my space, in private business, my upside's not limited.
Correct.
And this comes down to risk. The other thing that all this comes down to on the financial side of things is risk. So people who invest in these investor-owned utilities are taking some risk, but they're also accepting a lower return for you all looking out and minimizing their risk, if you would, as well. Lower risk, lower return. I'm good with that.
Yeah, that's a great sort of explanation of the regulatory compact.
Yeah, there you go. So it cuts both ways a little bit is what I'm sort of saying. The third choice being all the taxpayers. So in the worst case scenario, we spread these costs not just to the people who are using that power and their lights are switching on and they've paid their utility bills or not. The third choice, which we don't ever want to get to, is just spreading the cost over everybody, which we do in some way because we pay for you guys to do this, right? And that's paid by all the taxpayers. So those are really the only three choices of where the who pays in this case. The specific customer of the utility, the owners of the utility, or the taxpayers. And we are limiting the owners of the utility on the upside return, unlike in business where I can take as much upside as I could, depending on my customers. The comment was made about you set a rate and then you go back and say, oh, I was wrong, and you can't go back and increase the cost to your customer. So my comment would be, and now I'm getting into the point of just commenting here, is most of the extraordinary events that affect my business and my upside potential, frankly, come from the government, come out of Washington, D.C. Our costs for this past year were up dramatically to the tune of about 30%, all in response to extraordinary events, decisions that were made primarily in Washington that affect my company. So I have a couple of choices on cost. One is the first thing, in our case, it's the opposite. The first thing that happens to us is, because our rates were already set, is it comes out of the people that own the business, me. Number two is, and I think this is what is being missed and suggested here, is that, yeah, it could be out of future rates. I have to raise my rates in the future to make up the losses that I had because of these extraordinary events that largely were government made, or I go out of business, and nobody cares and nobody helps if I go out of business because of extraordinary events. My costs were too high. But in this case, isn't one of your charges to be in charge is to make sure that these utilities don't go out of business and we continue to have electricity. Nobody cares if you can't go skiing anymore, but if the lights don't on, somebody cares.
Correct.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's a big difference there. And so I just really wanted to make the point that extraordinary events are not necessarily just weather events or anomalies or things that have changed in that regard. Extraordinary events, and sometimes are somebody wrote some code and put it into statute that is a major change. And I would argue, living my whole life in a community where we had ash pits and coal-fired plants, where those ash pits were regulated to an extremely high degree about how they were done, how they could be maintained, what they had to do at the time it happened. Then somewhere down the line, after the fact, the rules got changed, and now we're faced with dealing with who pays. And so I just wanted to point that out. Even though we're limited on the number of people to which we can spread these costs, I struggle a little bit with hypocrisy saying is that shouldn't be borne by the ratepayers. It should be borne by someone else. Lastly, I would say in business, for me personally, and I would say looking back, there were some periods of time, I like to think of myself as an entrepreneur. I've started a lot of businesses, but there was a period of time, and I won't talk about whose specific regime we were under, but the challenges of starting a new business became very, very high, and nobody was doing it. And the reason was this, is because in the end, if you cannot win in business, you will not play. There has to be the ability to make money, or why do it? I would argue that if we just simply put all the costs associated on the investors with extraordinary events, those investors will not play because it's not a safe bet anymore. And then suddenly we're faced with all these costs shifting over to the taxpayer. Maybe that's the right answer, but I just wanted to point out that we're looking at a microcosm here. This is a much bigger picture, and I appreciate you educating us. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Luke. Chairman Soliday to close on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Just a couple points that have been made multiple times, but maybe I should make them again. One, is there clear accounting rules what can be deferred? That's accounting. It has nothing to do with the IURC. That's the FASB. It says extraordinary things may be deferred, and the accountants decide that. The accountants decide that based upon previous history, so forth and so on. Once they have deferred those, and the advantage to deferring is the IURC to grant recovery in CPCNs or in rate cases is we want details where the money went. When you are getting pre-approval, you are guessing. So, number two, CPCNs and rate cases allow for public comment. Lots of it. A year. Thousands of documents. The public is included. They get to comment. Three, the IURC gave you a couple examples. I can give you more where the IURC has said, I don't care if it's deferred or not. That's irrational. We're not doing it. So, one, there are rules to even book it. Two, you don't get a dime until the IURC has acted. Three, the IURC actions are available to public for the public to comment. This is a really important bill. I'm a little animated in the allegations that Senator Koch and I would bring something to you and say to you, this is just restoring things to the way they were. That's all it does. And we're going to take another hard look at it when we have more time this summer, and we'll be coming back because there are other things that need to be cleaned up. The people can participate. They don't get a dime until the IURC acts. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Soliday.
Do pass.
Second. Bill's been moved and seconded. Please call the roll.
Senator Yoder.
explain my vote briefly, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
I still have questions because for me, I thought the bill was saying that these are items, it's a pretty broad list of where we don't need to get pre-approval. And I agree that these cases, the pre-approval process does permit the public and ratepayers to participate in that discussion. So I'm confused as to, because I didn't read 1417, nor did today clarify that. So for now, I'm a no.
Senator Breaux.
Yeah, I'll just quickly explain my vote. I just feel, and I fundamentally disagree with you, Senator Perfect, but I just feel this gives the utilities a blank check that they don't have to get any approval until after the fact, if they want to, and I don't have the confidence that the IURC does have that backbone gene to stand up and say no. So I'm very fearful for this bill and the impact it will have on ratepayers. So I am a definite no.
Senator Hunley.
No.
Senator Perfect.
I already explained my vote, so yes.
Senator Dorio.
Yes.
Senator Zay.
A quick comment, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
You may.
I think Senator Perfect's analogy and discussion was very apropos in relationship to this discussion. It's difficult to compare our business world versus a regulated business world, and I think that's dictated and created some of the confusion today. The fact is we do want the lights to come on, and there are protections in place with the IURC to do that very thing, and as well as the return. There are investors that are participating in investor-related utilities, and we want them to be profitable to turn the lights on. And I think, I don't have those protections in my business as you don't have in yours. And that is an arena or in a way that we choose to do it in Indiana. And I think between our leadership in both houses and the utilities, it's been made very clear that a regulated state is much better than our friends that are trying to do this in a deregulated world. So just assuring those comments, but I think this is an important bill. And I think regulation is also can be a catastrophic event, as we've talked about with coal ash. When administrations change and regulations are put in place, coal ash has become a much bigger deal. And I understand all sides of that, and I'm not here to debate that, but regulation does add to these extraordinary costs where there can be deferred accounting and necessary accommodations for that. For that, I am a yes, and thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you.
Senator Byrne.
It's an aye.
Senator Deary.
Yes.
Senator Lysing.
Yes.
Senator Donato.
Yes.
Chairman Koch.
Chair votes aye.
Vote is 8 in favor with 3 opposed.
Bill passes 8-3. Thank you, committee, for your hard work on this bill. And I think next week we meet as Commerce. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Thank you all.